Chapter 7. Women Know the Cost. The reaction was immediate. It was strong, unfiltered, and, for many people watching it unfold, deeply uncomfortable. Within hours of the Coldplay jumbotron clip going viral on July 16, 2025, women were responding in volumes and with an intensity that the internet quickly began to categorize. Some responded with sharp humor, some with anger, some with a specific cutting recognition that found its expression in memes, in comment threads, in the kind of sardonic solidarity that women sometimes deploy when they see something they have seen before. And almost as quickly as the response came, a second response followed, the response to the response. Why are women so harsh on other women? Where is the sisterhood? Why are they turning on her instead of standing together? It is a question that appears with reliable frequency in moments like this one, and it is not always asked in good faith. Sometimes it is a genuine inquiry into the dynamics of female solidarity and its limits. More often, it is a rhetorical move, a way of reframing the substance of what women were saying as a problem with how they were saying it, and in doing so, avoiding the question of why so many women were saying it at all. This chapter is about why, about what the response actually was, where it came from, what it understood that it was accused of not understanding, and what it got wrong in ways that require honest examination. Because this is the chapter the book has been building toward, the place where recognition, memory, gendered double standards, and the specific complexity of female solidarity all converge, and it will not do any of them justice by being simple about any of them. This was not random, the first thing to establish clearly, because it was the first thing to be contested, is that the women who responded strongly to the Coldplay jumbotron clip were not responding randomly. They were not performing cruelty for its own sake, not expressing jealousy dressed up as moral outrage, not simply demonstrating the internet's tendency to pile on. The response was not baseless. It came from somewhere specific, and understanding where it came from is not the same as endorsing every form it took. Research consistently documents that women respond to infidelity, particularly to the figure of the other woman, with a specific intensity that has often been attributed, incorrectly and reductively, to competition or jealousy. The actual research tells a more precise story. Studies on infidelity response find that women are significantly more distressed by emotional infidelity than by sexual infidelity alone, a pattern that evolutionary psychologists have attributed to the specific threat that emotional investment outside the primary relationship poses to the security and stability of the family unit. When women watch two people at a Coldplay concert sway together with the ease of people who had spent time becoming fluent in each other's rhythms, what many of them registered was not just a physical moment. They registered an emotional one. And emotional betrayal, research confirms, is the specific category of betrayal that most consistently produces the most visceral response in women. But there is something even more specific than the research on infidelity response that explains what happened on July 16th, something that does not require peer review to understand. It is the phenomenon that Chapter 1 of this book called recognition. The sense, immediate and almost physical, of seeing something external that mirrors something internal, something that has been lived or feared or narrowly escaped. And recognition, when it arrives with that force, does not produce neutral responses. It produces the response that belongs to the thing being recognized. For a very large number of women, what they recognized was not a stranger's situation. It was the shape of their own fear. The specific, quiet, often unspoken fear that sits in the background of many intimate relationships. What is happening when I am not there to see it? What does ordinary familiarity look like from the outside when I cannot see the outside? What if the story I believe about my own life is not the whole story? That fear does not arrive at the Coldplay clip for the first time. It arrives already formed, already inhabited, already weighted by years of private experience that the person watching the clip has never had occasion to speak about publicly. And when something on a jumbotron, of all places, gives that fear a visible form, holds it up on a screen where it can be seen, the response is not calm. It is not measured. It is the response of a person who has just had something private made suddenly, unexpectedly public. Pain recognizes itself. There is a particular kind of recognition that does not require explanation. It is faster than thought. It is the moment when something in the external world mirrors something in the internal one with enough precision that the body responds before the mind has had time to articulate why. Researchers studying betrayal trauma have documented this response with some care. Women who have experienced infidelity, either as the betrayed partner or as someone who watched it happen to someone they love, show measurably heightened responses to stimuli that pattern match the dynamics of their own experience. The jumbotron clip for these women was not just content, it was a pattern match. The ease of the embrace, the specific quality of two people who have forgotten to perform distance because they have stopped feeling it, the instinctive duck when the camera found them. These were not abstract images. They were recognizable. They were the specific collection of signals that, in the private experience of many women, had been the last thing they saw before something changed. And when pain recognizes itself, when the body knows before the mind does that this is the shape of something it has encountered before, the response is rarely polished. It is not the response you would give if you had time to compose yourself, to apply the appropriate caveats, to acknowledge that you do not know the full story, to give the benefit of the doubt that the situation technically deserves. It is the response of recognition, raw, immediate, informed by experience rather than by information. The women who responded most fiercely to the Coldplay clip were not, in the main, responding to Kristen Cabot as a specific individual. They were responding to Kristen Cabot as the visible form of something they recognized from their own lives. She became, whether she chose to or not, the representative of a pattern. And the response to the pattern was the response that the pattern had been accumulating, quietly, in the private lives of the people watching, for years. What she represented. When Cabot eventually spoke, in December to the New York Times, in March to Oprah, one of the strongest themes she raised was this: that women had judged her more harshly than Andy Byron. That much of the criticism focused on her appearance, her career, her presumed route to a senior position, that she felt acutely and with some bitterness that the sisterhood she had perhaps expected to extend some degree of solidarity had instead turned with particular force on her. She told Oprah that she had given a lot of thought to whether it is men or women who hold women back, and that she had reached the conclusion that women are holding themselves back tremendously by cutting each other down. She cited Ryan Reynolds and Gwyneth Paltrow's astronomer advertisement as particularly disappointing, specifically because Paltrow, a woman who had built a brand around women's empowerment, had participated in something that contributed to Cabot's continued humiliation. Some of this analysis is accurate and deserves to be taken seriously. The specific anatomization of her physical appearance, the commentary on her age, her body, the way she looked in the clip, is a form of critique that does not get applied with equivalent intensity to male figures in equivalent situations. The assumption that her position was obtained through the relationship rather than through professional competence is a prejudice applied to women in senior positions, with a frequency that has nothing to do with this particular case. These things are real. The double standard is real. But the analysis contains a move that this book cannot let pass without examination. The suggestion that the response to what the jumbotron clip appeared to show was primarily a failure of female solidarity, rather than also a recognition of something that many women in the watching audience had personally experienced. The question of whether women are holding each other back is a legitimate question in many contexts. In this specific context, it performs a function that is less clear-eyed. It reframes the response of women who had been on the receiving end of the dynamic the clip appeared to represent. Women who had been Megan Kerrigan Byron, or who had feared being her, as a problem of women's failure to support other women. But Megan Kerrigan Byron is also a woman, and the women in the audience who had lived a version of her experience are also women. Sisterhood, in the version of it that demands solidarity only with the woman who was visible and who was speaking, is not sisterhood. It is visibility bias dressed in the language of solidarity. The misunderstanding of sisterhood. The concept of sisterhood, of women supporting each other across the divisions of circumstance and choice, is one of the most debated concepts in contemporary feminism, precisely because it has been asked to carry more weight than any single concept can hold. It has been invoked to demand unconditional support for individual women, regardless of what those women have done. It has been invoked to silence criticism that is legitimate and necessary, and it has been invoked, most damagingly, as though it applied only to the woman who was visible and not to the woman who was not. Genuine solidarity does not mean never criticizing other women. It means applying criticism consistently with the same standard, the same intensity, and the same willingness to examine context that would be applied regardless of gender. The failure of solidarity in this story is not primarily the failure of the women who responded to the clip. It is the failure of a public discourse that has spent months examining every dimension of Kristen Cabot's experience and has not, in the same breath, extended equivalent attention to Megan Kerrigan Byron's. Sisterhood that only flows toward the woman on the stage is not sisterhood. It is a performance of it. And it asks the women in the audience, the ones who recognized the clip from the inside, who knew what it felt like to be on the other side of the dynamic being depicted, to suppress their recognition in the name of a solidarity that does not extend to them. The women who responded most strongly to the clip were not failing sisterhood. They were, in many cases, expressing it, imperfectly, often unfairly, sometimes cruelly, but from a place of genuine recognition of what the woman who was not on the stage might be going through. That recognition deserves to be acknowledged, even when the form it took cannot always be defended. Projection versus pattern recognition. Not all of the response was recognition. Some of it was projection. This distinction matters, and intellectual honesty requires making it. Projection is the process of attributing to others the emotions, motivations, and experiences that belong to oneself. It is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, and it is particularly active in situations that trigger personal history. When a woman who has been betrayed watches the Coldplay clip and responds with a fury that seems disproportionate to the specific facts of the situation, when the response is less about what is actually known and more about the totality of what has been experienced, that is, at least in part, projection, the clip becomes the container for a private story. The people in it become characters from that story. The The response is directed at the clip, but powered by something that predates it. This matters because projection, when it operates at scale, can produce responses that are genuinely unjust to the specific individuals who happen to serve as its trigger. Kristen Cabot, whatever her choices, whatever the moral weight of those choices, was not every other woman in every other version of this story. She was a specific person in a specific situation with specific context that the women watching the clip did not have access to. The specific context, when it eventually emerged, was more complicated than the clip suggested. The projection did not always make room for that complexity. But there is a difference between projection and pattern recognition, and collapsing the two, treating all strong responses to the clip as projection, performs exactly the move that this chapter is arguing against. Pattern recognition is what happens when someone's response to a situation is informed by genuine, accumulated experience of a pattern rather than by the distortion of a personal wound. The women who had been in Megan Kerrigan Byron's position were not projecting when they recognized the clip's dynamic. They were applying knowledge. The knowledge was specific, embodied, and hard-won. And it was not wrong. The question of whether a given woman's response was primarily projection or primarily pattern recognition is ultimately not answerable from the outside. But the question matters because the standard criticism of the women who responded to the clip, that they were bitter, jealous, unfairly harsh, failing to extend the same grace they would want for themselves, assumes projection as the operating mechanism. It does not account for the possibility, well supported by everything this book has established, that for many women the response was not distortion, but clarity. Sexism and truth can coexist. The most intellectually difficult part of this chapter is also the most necessary, holding simultaneously the fact that the response to the Coldplay clip contained genuine sexism and the fact that it also contained genuine recognition. These things are not mutually exclusive. They coexist in the response in ways that cannot be cleanly separated, and the attempt to separate them, to say either the response was a valid expression of pattern recognition and therefore the sexism doesn't matter, or the response was sexist and therefore the recognition is invalid, produces a distorted account of what actually happened. The sexism is real and specific. Research consistently finds that women who are unfaithful face harsher social judgment than men in equivalent situations across cultures and across centuries. As the research on gendered double standards in infidelity documents, when a man cheats, the reaction is often laced with resignation or even normalization. When a woman cheats, the response is more likely to be moralistic, shaming, and emotionally intense. The perceived meaning is different. Men's infidelity is often downplayed or rationalized. Women's infidelity is read as a deep betrayal of love, family, and femininity, a violation of the qualities that women are expected, culturally and socially, to embody. This applied to the Coldplay clip. The scrutiny of Cabot's physical appearance had no male equivalent. Byron's body was not anatomized in the comment threads. The assumptions about how she had obtained a senior position reflected the specific prejudice that women in leadership are often presumed to have arrived there through relationships rather than through competence. The tone of some of the criticism, its contempt, its reduction of her to a type, drew from a cultural vocabulary for judging women that is harsher, more specific, and more personal than the equivalent vocabulary for judging men. The recognition is also real and specific. Women who responded to the clip with anger or sharpness were not, for the most part, motivated primarily by sexist categories. They were motivated by the experience of having been or having feared being in Megan Kerrigan Byron's position. The anger was not directed at Cabot as a woman. It was directed at a dynamic, a specific, recognizable dynamic, of which Cabot was the visible representative. The gender of the person being criticized was incidental to the substance of the criticism, even when the form of the criticism was gendered in ways that reflected wider cultural biases. Both truths have to be held. The form of the criticism was often sexist. The substance of the criticism was often valid. Acknowledging one does not erase the other. And a conversation that only acknowledges one, that focuses only on the sexism and dismisses the recognition, or that defends the recognition and ignores the sexism, is not a complete conversation. It is a selective one. Accountability is not betrayal. The version of sisterhood that was invoked to criticize the women who responded to the clip is a version that treats accountability as its opposite, as though holding another woman to a standard, as though naming what a choice costs someone else, as though refusing to extend unconditional sympathy to a person whose choices harmed people who could not advocate for themselves, is an act of betrayal against the collective. It is not. Accountability is structure. It is the recognition that actions have consequences beyond the person who takes them. It is the insistence that being a woman does not exempt someone from responsibility for the impact of their choices on other people, including other women. The women who were most directly harmed by the dynamic the Coldplay clip represented were women. Megan Kerrigan Byron is a woman. The children who carry the weight of disruption are in part daughters. The betrayed partners who watched the clip and felt their own history land in their bodies are women. A solidarity that requires the suppression of their recognition in order to protect the public image of the woman on the stage is not solidarity. It is hierarchy. It is the allocation of sisterhood based on visibility, which amounts in practice to the allocation of sisterhood based on who controls the narrative, holding Cabot accountable for the choices she made, not in the terms that the death threats and the harassment and the anatomization of her appearance offered, which were cruel and disproportionate and wrong, but in the honest terms that this book has been applying throughout, is not a betrayal of women. It is an application of the same standard that would be applied to anyone, regardless of gender, who made choices that harmed people without a platform to describe the harm. The man who was not questioned enough. And then there is Andy Byron. This has to be said directly and with the emphasis it deserves, because this book has not allowed it to recede into the background even when the narrative pressure to do so has been considerable. The asymmetry between the public response to Kristen Cabot and the public response to Andy Byron is not incidental to the story of women's response to the Coldplay clip. It is central to it. Byron was in the frame, not figuratively, literally. He was on the jumbotron. He was the CEO who had developed a relationship with his direct report, who was also the head of his company's human resources function. He was the person who, by Cabot's account, misrepresented the status of his marriage to someone who trusted him. He was the person who, when the story went viral and became global news, resigned and disappeared, issuing no statement, giving no interviews, offering no public accounting of any kind for a situation in which his choices were at least as significant as Cabot's, and by some measures more so. And the women who tore apart Cabot's physical appearance. Where was the equivalent commentary on Byron? The women who assumed Cabot had slept her way to her position. What did they say about the CEO who reportedly misled the woman who trusted him and then allowed her to carry the full weight of the public aftermath alone? The viral memes centered Cabot. The trending topics centered Cabot. The death threats were directed at Cabot. Byron was present in the commentary as context, as the boss, the CEO, the man she was with, and then he stepped back and the commentary stepped back with him, and the story became, in the public record, primarily about her. Cabot named this directly and correctly. The asymmetry of consequence is real, it is gendered, and it is unjust. "I have to explain and justify," she told Oprah. "He doesn't. He has the luxury of staying silent." This is accurate, and it deserves to be central to any analysis of the women's response to the clip, because the harshness directed at Cabot and the relative silence around Byron are two sides of the same gendered coin. The double standard does not only protect men from scrutiny, it redirects scrutiny onto women in ways that make women the primary target of criticism for situations in which men's choices were equally or more consequential. Correcting that double standard does not mean removing accountability from Cabot. It means applying it fully to both people in the frame. This book has been doing that from its first chapter. It is the standard that the public response did not apply consistently, and its failure to do so is a failure of the gendered logic that this chapter is examining. Why the response matters. The response to the Coldplay clip matters, beyond the specific story of two people at a concert, because it reveals something about how women's collective knowledge of infidelity and its costs is stored, transmitted, and expressed. It is not stored in academic journals or clinical reports, though the research in those places confirms what the knowledge already knows. It is stored in lived experience, in the conversations women have with each other, quietly, that never reach public stages, in the shared understanding that circulates through female networks in the form of recognition rather than testimony. When the Coldplay clip went viral, what it did, among everything else it did, was provide a visible, shareable, common object for that stored knowledge to organize around. It gave the private, accumulated understanding of millions of women a moment to recognize itself in public. And the response was what the response always is when private knowledge finds a public mirror: disproportionate, in the sense that it exceeded what the specific facts of the specific situation warranted, and entirely proportionate, in the sense that it was exactly scaled to the full weight of what was being recognized. The intensity of the response was not, in the end, about Kristen Cabot. It was about every version of the dynamic she represented, every relationship in which the ordinary familiarity of two people occupying the same professional space slowly became something else, every partner who was the last to know, every child who processed disruption in silence, every woman who sat with the question, "What if this is happening when I am not looking?" and had eventually the answer. That is the response the Coldplay clip produced, not because two people at a concert were more important than the situations those women had lived, but because 15 seconds of footage gave shape to something that had previously only lived in the private interior of their own experience. The balance we must hold. This chapter has been holding a tension that it now needs to name explicitly because the book has been building toward it and because naming it directly is the only honest way to close. The women who responded to the Coldplay clip were, in many cases, responding from a place of genuine knowledge and genuine recognition. That knowledge deserves to be honored, not dismissed as bitterness or competition or the failure of sisterhood. It was informed, it was real, and it was, in its substance, if not always in its form, pointed in the direction of something that was actually there. The form that the response took was, in many cases, unjust. The death threats were inexcusable. The anatomization of Cabot's appearance was sexist. The assumptions about her career were prejudiced. the pile-on dynamic of the internet, which amplified and rewarded the most extreme expressions of outrage while drowning out the more measured ones, produced something that harmed a real person in ways that cannot be defended by pointing to the legitimacy of the underlying recognition. Both things are true. The recognition was real. The expression of it was often wrong. And the path through that tension, the path this book is trying to walk, is not to choose between them. It is to acknowledge both and to ask the question that follows: what would it look like to honor the knowledge without excusing the cruelty? To validate the recognition without validating the mob? To hold Cabot accountable in the terms that honesty requires while refusing the terms that the Internet's justice system offered? It looks, perhaps, something like this book. It looks like naming what women know, from experience, from memory, from the specific embodied understanding of what infidelity costs the people in its path, without using that knowledge to justify harm. It looks like acknowledging the double standard without using it to erase accountability. It looks like expanding the frame of sisterhood to include the women who are not on the stage, whose silence is not passivity, but the specific, dignified response of someone who was not given a platform and chose not to perform their grief for an audience that had not earned it. Women know the cost, not in theory, in experience, in observation, in memory, in the stories shared quietly, long before they ever reach a public stage. What they did with that knowledge in the weeks after July 16th, 2025, was imperfect. Some of it was cruel. Some of it was unjust. Some of it reflected exactly the gendered biases that the story itself had exposed, now turned inward and used as weapons. But underneath all of that, the knowledge itself was not wrong. It was not wrong about what the clip appeared to show. It was not wrong about the pattern it recognized. It was not wrong about who was likely carrying the weight that the visible narrative was not acknowledging. And it was not wrong about the question it kept asking, in 1,000 different registers and tones and degrees of cruelty. Where is the other woman in this story? That question, posed imperfectly, answered imperfectly, is nevertheless the right question. It is the one this book has been asking since its first page, and it is the one that the public conversation around the Coldplay story has, despite everything, still not fully answered.